Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a rainy night. I'm Brendan Smith. I'm the Arts and Humanities Coordinator for the City of Tacoma Park. And this is the latest event in our Tacoma Park Arts Cultural Series. We have film screenings, lectures, and art exhibitions. This is our first event that we have organized celebrating Black History Month. We'll also be having a concert tomorrow night at 8 p.m. with Yasmin Williams, a guitarist. Next Thursday at 7:30 p.m., we'll have a showing of vintage civil rights films, so we hope you can make it out for those too. You can also go to tacomaparkmd.gov/arts to find out more news about all of our upcoming events. So tonight we're very excited to have Diane Cross here talking about her great-great-grandfather, Sergeant Isaac Hall. I'm going to hand things over to Diane now. Thank you.
Good evening. It is my pleasure to be here, and I really thank you all for coming out on such a rainy night. I would like to ask you to hold all questions and comments until the end of the presentation. Thank you. The year 2011 was the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the start of the Civil War, a war that would last for 4 long years and claim as many lives as all of our other wars combined. In 1863, the black man was called to fight, and over 200,000 would answer that call. This evening, I'd like to share with you the story of one of those men. For as long as I can remember life, the picture of that soldier hung in my grandmother's living room. As children, my siblings and cousins, we didn't know who he was. We didn't even know if he was a real person. But we knew he was a soldier, and that's what we called him, the soldier. While I was still young, I guess my grandmother thought it was time to tell me of my roots. She said the soldier was her grandfather, and that he fought in the Civil War. His father was born in Africa, brought to this country as a young boy, and sold into slavery. Well, I have to tell you, I was a grandma's girl. I spent so much time with my grandmother that my brother used to tease me that I was old like Nana. But I listened to her stories, her old slavery time stories, as she used to call them. Some were cute and funny, where the slave would outwit the owner, and then there were those that were neither cute nor funny. But she talked about our family in the old days. She said we were great cakewalkers. I had no idea what the cakewalk was. But I did a little research, and I found that in the 1850s, on southern plantations, slaves would get together as a form of entertainment, and they would imitate their owners. And when it came to the cakewalk, what they were imitating is what they thought was high society. So you see, that was a very high-stepping, strutting, prancing type dance. And the owners got involved because the people that did these dances were called walkers, and they wanted to see who had the best walkers. And they gave out prizes to the man. He would get a cake, but not cake as we know it. He would get a big biscuit wrapped in a cabbage leaf. And the lady would get a pulled molasses type candy. And my grandmother said the Halls always went home with the prize. And 2015, I was in Gettysburg for Remembrance Day, and I went to the ball that evening, and they played the ladies' cakewalk. And I want you to know that yours truly went home with the prize. Well, my grandmother also talked about her family, but she talked about the family that she said we were nice-looking people. That her mother, Rachel, was the belle of Georgetown, Delaware, and that her grandfather had attended a function one evening, and the next morning she heard the neighbors say, Ike Hall was there, looking like 24-karat gold. Well, gold looks good to most of us, so he must have looked pretty good. And to this very day in our family, when we want to give the ultimate compliment, we tell each other, you look like 24-karat gold. Well, as time went on, the picture was just part of the furnishings in my grandmother's living room. And it wasn't until the Roots came on the first time that we even thought about it. That and Roots, just to give you a little refresher, Alex Haley, he traced his ancestry back to Gambia to his ancestor Kunta Kinte, and while I was watching it, and he came over also as a young man sold into slavery, and while I was watching it, I was, wait a minute, I've heard this story before. My grandmother talking about her grandfather's father. And at that time, she mentioned also that his slave name was Tunnel. Well, anyway, as I'm watching it, I went to my grandmother, and by this time she had failed considerably. But I asked her, I said, Nana, you said that your grandfather's father's name, slave name was Tunnel. Did you know another name for him, maybe an African name? She said, no. And she said, I just can't remember. And shortly after that, my grandmother passed away. But it wasn't until near the end of her life did I realize how much the picture meant to her. She sold her home and moved into an apartment and had beautiful antiques. But of all her possessions, she said, I want to hold on to this for as long as I can keep house. And she told my mother, she said, when I'm no longer able to take care of my home, I want you to have it because I know you'll take care of it. And take care of it my mother did until she was no longer able to keep her house. Well, time goes on, and then we have the Ken Burns theory of the Civil War. And I was working at that time, and a couple of my coworkers, we were talking about how well done it was, how much we enjoyed it. And I took the opportunity then to tell them that my great-great-grandfather fought in the Civil War. They said, did he fight with the 54th? And I said, I have almost nothing to go on. And many of you may have seen the movie Glory, and that was based on the 54th Massachusetts, which was the first black regiment raised in the North. So I said, only thing I have is a picture, and I know his name. He said, you have a picture? I said, yes. Is he in uniform? I said, yes. A friend of mine worked for National Geographic, and I asked him if he would come and photograph the picture, and he did. And I took it into work. And one of my coworkers was a Civil War reenactor. So he took one look at this. He said, he's infantry. I said, how can you tell? He said, the light blue pants. I have the same uniform. And then he said he was an enlisted man. He wasn't contraband. Contraband were many of the enslaved Africans that followed the troops. He said, no, this man was an enlisted man. And since we knew his name, we did a search under Isaac Hall, and what they fought in were the U.S. colored troops. And we found that there were 7 Isaac Halls who fought in the U.S. colored troops. So you see, my work was cut out for me. But I always like to say at this part of the presentation, I'm just so glad his name was not John Smith. Well, we did the search, and then we found out, and then I said, well, I have to call my cousin who has my grandmother's Bible. And I asked him, was there anything in the Bible about the Hall side of the family? He said, no. And then he said, wait a minute, Di. On a paper napkin, my grandmother had written her grandfather's name and the month, her grandfather's name, Isaac Hall, and the month and the year that he died, and her grandmother's name, Lavinia Hall, and the month and the year that she died, and placed it in the Bible as if to say, someone is going to be looking for this. Well, as time goes on, we had another friend join our little band of history detectives, and I told him the same thing. I said, I'd love to find out more about him, because the picture's starting to come alive a little bit to me. But I said, I have so little to go on. But I told you I was a grandma's girl, and I listened to her stories, and that she said her mother was the belle of Georgetown, Delaware. So we did a search on Georgetown, Delaware, and found that it was in Sussex County. And one of the 7 Isaac Halls who had enlisted was from Sussex County. So again, time went on, and when I see this friend again, He hands me an envelope. Well, when I opened the envelope, it was the service records for Isaac Hall. Well, I was so excited, I could hardly hold on to them. I read them, I reread them, I put them down, picked them up. I just was just overwhelmed. But I was excited, but still, I had a nagging feeling because we're talking about 7 Isaac Halls, and I wanted to make sure I had the right one. So I went down to the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C., and I spoke to the curator, and I said, I feel 9 and 9/10 sure that this is my ancestor, but I want to see something that connects me to him. He said, you need to look at pension records. Pension records read like a biography. So I went down to National Archives. That's where his service records had been obtained. And I asked for the pension records for Isaac Hall. Again, I was handed an envelope, and when I opened it up, they were the original documents. These documents were so old, they had not been digitized, that the edges crumbled as I read them. And I read the document. It said that he was married. His wife's name was Lovey, and that he had been married by a preacher, and I'm reading it. But the name Lovey, I said, no, the Bible said Lavinia. So, that wasn't a deterrent, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I seem to remember my grandmother talking about Lovey. So I continued to read on, and when I got to his 7 children, I knew then beyond a doubt that I had found my ancestor, because there listed was my great-grandmother Rachel and other names I had heard all of my life. I knew then I had found my ancestor. Isaac Hall was born a slave in March of 1839. He was born in the service of David Hall, who had owned his parents as well. He was a slave for the first 26 years of his life. The Emancipation Proclamation did not affect Isaac Hall. The Emancipation Proclamation only affected those slaves in the states that were in rebellion, in the states that had seceded. Delaware was one of the 5 border states. These were slave states that had remained loyal to the Union. Isaac Hall was still a slave. His path to freedom was the War Department General Order 329, issued October 3, 1863. It was in 1863 that President Lincoln was beginning to realize, with low enlistment and even lower morale, that he was not going to win the war without the help of the black man. I'd like to read a quote to you. Without the military help of the black freedmen, the war against the South could not have been won. President Abraham Lincoln, 1865. Now, the War Department General Order, it allowed for recruiting offices to be set up in these border states. Now, for the freedmen, it wasn't a problem. They could just go and enlist. But a slave was considered property. But this order addressed that. They offered loyal slaveholders compensation up to $300 for the enlistment of their slaves into the military. Now, but there were several steps you had to do to file a slave claim, as they were called. Firstly, you had to swear allegiance, that you were loyal to the government and to the Constitution of the United States. Secondly, you had to prove it was your slave. You just couldn't walk in there with any black person trying to collect your $300. Where there's money, there's corruption. David Hall was claimant number 28 in the state of Delaware. Claimant number 27 was less of an honorable man. He arrived with a free black apprentice trying to pass him off as his slave. He was discovered, his claim was denied, and he was labeled a scoundrel. Many of you may have seen the movie 12 Years a Slave. Yes, those things did happen. Then you had to show proof that you had enlisted your slave into into the service. And this order also stated, for all those who fought in the service of the United States would be forever thereafter free. You had to free your slave. Well, David Hall did all that he was required to do, and he received his $300. But more importantly, my great-great-grandfather, classified as a slave for life, was now a free man. Now, I have copies of the documents that David Hall signed. And the first one, and you'll bear with me because this is in his handwriting, but it was the most emotional for me because we're talking about a title to a human being. Evidence of title. I, David Hall of Baltimore 100, Sussex County and State of Delaware, do hereby certify that Isaac Hall, who has enlisted in the 32nd Regiment, U.S. Colored Troops, Company K, is my slave. And at the date of his enlistment, as aforesaid, he was owing me service for and during the term of his natural life, and that I became possessed of him by reason of him being born of slave parents in my service. This is David Hall, 1865. Deed of manumission and release of service. This is the document that gave Isaac Hall his freedom. Deed of manumission and release of service. Whereas my slave, Isaac Hall, has enlisted in the service of the United States, now in consideration thereof, I, David Hall of Sussex County, Delaware, do hereby, in consideration of said enlistment, manumit, set free, and release the above-named Isaac Hall from all service due me, his freedom to commence on the 3rd day of March, 1864, the date of his enlistment in the aforesaid 32nd Regiment of Colored Troops in the service of the United States. Certificate of the Award of Board of Claims, Office of the Board of Claims for slaves enlisted in the service of the United States, Georgetown, Delaware, March 27, 1865. We hereby certify that David Hall of Sussex County, Delaware, having proved under oath his loyalty to the Constitution and government of the United States, and established his title as to the ownership of Isaac Hall, a slave enlisted at Wilmington, Delaware, on the 3rd of March, 1864, by a Captain D.S. Yardley in the service of the United States in the 32nd Regiment of Colored Troops, Company K, and having filed a valid deed of manumission and release of service of said slave, is entitled to the sum of $300, which has been awarded to him by this board as remuneration for all claim to the future labor or service of said slave under the provision of General Orders, War Department number 329, 1863. I'd like to read a quote to you. Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States. Frederick Douglass. It was Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany who were largely responsible for persuading President Lincoln to enlist the black man. The 32nd Regiment of U.S. Colored Troops was organized at Camp William Penn, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, February 7th to March 7th, 1864, and then ordered to Hilton Head, South Carolina. Isaac Hall enlisted for a period of 3 years. Now, the USCTs, as they were called, United States Colored Troops, were the forerunners to the Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers were given their name by the native Cheyenne American for their fierce fighting spirit. Now, being able to use the internet, I was able to do a search on the regiment, and it gave me the complete service history, of which I'd like to highlight a couple of events. The first one was the Battle of Honey Hill, November 30th, 1864. This was the third battle of Sherman's march to the sea, but not led by General Sherman. The 32nd was part of a 5,000-man expedition, and the purpose of this expedition was to cut the Charleston-Savannah Railroad, which was the lifeline of the Confederacy. And it was the lifeline of the Confederacy. Had this been a success, which it wasn't, you have those that believe that the Charleston-Savannah Railroad would have fallen to the north, and the Savannah would have been evacuated, Charleston would have fallen, and the war would have been over. But it didn't happen that way. It didn't happen that way because the federal troops did not know the terrain of the land. Now, if you're ever in the area of Granville, South Carolina, you will find a road marker that reads thusly. Did I get ahead of myself here? There it is. Battle of Honey Hill. During this battle of November 30th, 1864, Confederate Commander Charles J. Colcock, by ordering that a nearby field of grass be set ablaze, delayed approaching federal troops and gave the Confederates time to collect additional forces. When the Confederate position could not be taken, the Union troops retreated. The site is located about a mile north. Well, when those federal troops got to that field, it was still burning. And on that day, it was recorded that a wind picked up and it blew the fire till it rained fire down on these troops. Now, uncontrolled fire will back up the best of us, and it did them. It put them in a complete state of disorder. But I believe that that fire paled in comparison to the fire of freedom that burned in these men. You see, the war had become personal to them. They were fighting for their freedom and for the freedom of their loved ones, most of whom were still in bondage. And I know in my heart of hearts and in my soul that my great-great-grandfather was fighting for me and you, the future generations. You see, those men, they knew what was behind them. They knew slavery. And they were not going back. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. So no, they were not successful on November 30th in cutting the Charleston-Savannah Railroad. But several days later, on December 6th, they were able to cut the line, which enabled Sherman to arrive in Savannah in triumph. Those men helped pave the way for Sherman's march to the sea. And the other event that I'd like to highlight to you was Potter's expedition. At the beginning of April in 1865, it was discovered that the enemy was moving his naval stores and other property of rebel government inland. Potter was sent with an expedition to intercept them, which he did successfully, capturing 20 locomotives and 200 freight cars, all heavily laden with naval supplies. Now, during this expedition, the 32nd was on the march every day, skirmishing every day for a period of more than 2 weeks, even on the afternoon of April 9th, when the news came that General Robert E. Lee had surrendered. Well, that was met with great joy, only to have that joy turn to sorrow several days later when the news came that President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. After the hostilities ceased, the regiment performed garrison duty at Charleston, Beaufort, and Hilton Head. The 32nd was at the fall of Charleston where it all began. About the middle of August, it was relieved of duty. On the 22nd of August, 1865, the 32nd Regiment of U.S. Colored Troops was mustered out of service in Hilton Head, South Carolina, and returned to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. There were those that wouldn't believe that the black man would fight, but Frederick S. Easton, an officer of the 32nd, told the American missionary that they can fight, have fought, and are willing to fight, and in no instance have they proved unworthy. According to Isaac Hall's muster out roll, as of August 22nd, 1865, he was last paid to February 28th, 1865. He owed $24.19 for clothing, $6 for arms and equipment, and then the word free is written here. Did I get it? Okay, the word free is written. And then it also says owes the U.S. $300. Now, did Isaac Hall have to pay the government the $300 that the government paid his owner? This is still under research. Isaac Hall was promoted twice within a 3-month period. He was promoted to corporal on January 1st, 1865, and to sergeant on March 18th, 1865. The War Department General Order 143, which deals with the promotions of the colored troops, it says, and I quote, "The non-commissioned officers of the colored troops may be selected and appointed from the best men of their number in the usual mode of appointing non-commissioned officers." A sergeant is a non-commissioned officer, and this confirms to me that my great-great-grandfather was among the best of his number. And as I continue to research him in the Civil War, I can certainly echo my grandmother's words in that Ike Hall was there looking like 24-karat gold. He did return to Sussex County, Delaware, to his wife and now 2 little girls. His second daughter was born 3 days after his enlistment. And my great-grandmother, Rachel, was born, I want to get ahead of myself. He now has 2 little girls, and his wife, my great-great-grandmother, Lovey Dingle Hall, was a free woman of color, listed in the 1850 census as being free in the household of the late Dr. Edward Dingle, who had been an abolitionist and also a member of the Delaware State House. Her 12-year-old brother resided there also. His name was John, and later he would join the Navy. They lived in the tri-state area of Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Isaac Hull mainly worked as a laborer, and his wife Lovey as a laundress. He was just the average kind of guy looking for a better way of life for himself and his family. There were times, though, when he was out of work unable to work for periods 2 and 3 weeks at a time, due to what his medical records described as a misery in his back. The misery was later diagnosed as kidney disease. On July 12th of 1902, Isaac Hall died at the age of 63 in Berwyn, Pennsylvania. He is buried at Mount Zion AME Church Cemetery, where he had been a member. In August of 2014, at my request, the VA gave him a marker for his grave site 112 years after his death. On October 5th, 2014, our family celebrated his life from a slave to a soldier to a free man. The 3rd Regiment of U.S. Colored Troops reenactors performed a graveside salute for him. Hold back. His name appears on the Wall of Honor at the African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C. He was listed in the 1900 census. In his household was his wife, Lovey, a 15-year-old grandson, George, a 7-year-old granddaughter, Helen. That 7-year-old granddaughter was my grandmother. Isaac Hall, no longer just a picture that hung in my grandmother's living room. He is real to me, so much so that I composed a letter to him that I'd like to share with you in closing. August 1st, 2009. My dear great-great-grandfather Hall, I am so very proud of you. My pride is overflowing knowing that you were one of the 209,145 African American Civil War soldiers who fought to abolish slavery and preserve the Union. I tell everyone I know about you. I am calling on your spirit to help direct me to find out more about you. You planted the seed of determination in us, your great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and so on down the line. We know now that our driving force comes from you. A slave for the first 26 years of your life, I can only imagine what you must have felt on that day in March of 1864 when given your freedom. On November 4th, 2008, 107 years after your death, our country elected its first African American president. I cried when the announcement was made. I know now that they were not only my tears, but yours as well. On Memorial Day of this year, 2009, President Barack Obama laid a wreath at the African American Civil War Memorial, your memorial, the spirit of freedom. Well, Grandfather, the Congress has also issued an apology for slavery. Well, Grandfather, you can rest easily and peacefully now. You have seen through your descendants, and I quote, the hope and the dream of the slave. We know that there is still much to be done, but we also know that your blood flows through our veins. We will now take over your watch. So with the aid of some old documents, oral family history, and heartfelt inspiration, I am going to continue to tell your story. I am your ever adoring great-great-granddaughter, Diane. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Diane. It's very moving. If anybody wants to ask any questions, we're filming this on YouTube, so just raise your hand and wait till you get the mic. And you go.
It's sort of a technical question in a way, but I know that photography was fairly early on at this time. Is that based on a photograph, or was that a portrait that was painted?
Well, based on a photograph, because during that time they had the smaller ones, and people were looking for something larger to hang on the wall. And it was during the time when crayon was first coming out, but not Crayola like we know it, but it was a sort of crayon and kind of chalk, and they wanted to put color to them, but originally they were the tin ones that were made larger. Any other questions, comments?
I wondered if that little church that you showed a slide of towards the end, is that still in existence?
Yes, it is.
And is it designated historic? It should be.
Yes, it is.
Oh, great. That's
and
great.
Right, when we did the reenactment, we had, it had been 60 years since anyone had been buried there. But that is the original church. They built a new one next to it, but that is the original church that he attended.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Buddy Daniels, American Legion Post 41. Thank you so much
Oh, you're
for what
welcome.
you've done. Thank you so much for what you did for your grandfather and the history, and the marker also in the ceremony. That's brought me to tears, I got to tell you.
Oh.
It means a lot. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Yes, and thank you again for your story. I was struck by the fact that I believe you said he enlisted in Wilmington, and that's not very close to Sussex County, so that was a bit of a trip back then, I would imagine.
Yeah, because Sussex County is in southern Maryland. Mm-hmm.
I very much appreciate your period dress. It's just absolutely beautiful. But two things, because number one, you have that non-period medal. What is that about?
This is that I am a direct descendant that can trace my ancestry back to a Civil War soldier.
That's
And
fabulous. And
direct.
thank you for that. And the other thing, because I know the red tape, how long did it take you to really get the marker to immortalize your grandfather? Great-great-grandfather.
Oh boy.
Well, congratulations on your pursuit, but I'd like to hear more about it.
Okay, it took, oh God, I guess over a month or so to do it, because I went to the Chester County VA, and I told them that I'd heard that if a service person didn't have a marker, that they would supply one. And he said yes. He said what they needed, the documentation and everything. And I said, well, he said, because we're doing World War II now. And I said, well, this is for the Civil War. So it was dead silence on the other end of his phone. So when he came back, he said, Miss, I can't wait to hang this phone up to tell everybody in the office about this conversation. But he hung in there, and I did get it. They pay for it. They supply it. All I had to do pay for installation. But it was well worth it because he deserved it. Mm-hmm. Any other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I don't need that mic. Trying to make me famous? No. Thank you so much. But I gotta be real. My emotions have clouded my capabilities to probably articulate the right question. The first thought is thank you.
Oh,
Thank you
you're
so
welcome.
much.
You're welcome.
As a
My
black man,
pleasure.
I'm like my friend she doesn't like the spotlight, so I ain't gonna put her on there. But she invited me out tonight, and I was like, man, that's just wonderful to tell our story. So the first thing I was thinking was, I need to collect my thoughts and reach out to you and just like, can I bombard you with questions? Because I'm like, man, I got so many. There was such, I mean, that was better than any of the movies that have come out to try to tell the story of some of our ancestors. So just again, do you have your information presented somewhere that we can reach out to you?
I have the DVDs. I don't know if you saw them when you walked in.
No.
And I continue to do speaking engagements because I feel that it's a story that needs to be told. What did you say?
I'm curious about, as far as $300, as far as how much that was then, and how, as far as widespread, sort of in Delaware, other areas, there were slave owners selling enslaved people essentially to the army. That's
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
an untold story, or at least one I wasn't familiar with.
Right, they were sold to the army. It wasn't like that you've been a good slave for 26 years, here's your freedom. No, they had to fight in the army for it.
Yeah, that stuck out very hard because I looked it up. I looked up how much $300 is.
It-
Until this time, it's like $4,300.
Yeah, it was over 1,000, I know that. And you said 43? 4,300. Yeah, it was expensive. Yes. Yes, I'm sorry.
I was just curious if the people that were were pushed into the military, did they receive any type of compensation that you are aware of?
Well, let me put it this way. At the time of his death, he was receiving a $10 pension, and he was trying to get it increased to $12 because $10 just was not enough to live off. Now, when he entered the service in 1864, he should have gotten was it $13 a month or something, the same as the white troops. Whether he did or not, I don't know. But he should have received that.
Thank you. Just to echo what everyone else is saying, this is an amazing story. I'm curious. You've answered this partially already, but I'll go ahead and ask it. So you talked about wanting to research more about whether he was asked or required to pay back the $300. Sounds like you're also researching. I'm just curious what other. You just seem to have so much. I also research genealogy, so I'm just so impressed with your research and everything
Thank you.
found.
Thank you.
And so I'm curious what other avenues of research for this ancestor or for other ancestors, what else you're exploring in this story? What are the unanswered questions for you still?
Well, about the $300. I had presented to a group of archaeologists, and one of them had said that the black troops, that they had garnished their payment, the ones that came in under the slave cane, and they took it out of their payment. But I have not seen anything to substantiate that, so that's why I always put in there, I'm still investigating that. And for this gentleman, I have a website, long overdue story.
Is that .com or
Yes.
what's the, okay.
Mhm.
Folks on YouTube will know where to go.
Okay. Yes.
So when you were talking about how they were sold into slavery, could they say no? And if they could, was there a punishment?
If they didn't go into the service, the punishment would be, I guess, that they would remain slaves because he was classified as a slave for life. So if they didn't go in, they were just going to be slaves forever. Thank you. My great-granddaughter, I'm so proud of her. Yes, ma'am.
I want to thank you so very much as well. And you kind of encouraged me to do better than what I have been doing in my life. I am from Philadelphia, and I remember growing up that my family used to talk about the Battle of Germantown. And there was this funeral home, Kirk and Nice, on Germantown Avenue and Washington Lane. And they kept telling me a lot of our ancestors are buried in a hole in the back of that church. And I always wanted to figure out how can I, and they're not marked, how can I figure out, how can I find out who's there? And you just encouraged me to go back and try to
And look at church records.
look at church records.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
And find a grave. That was another that I used for church records. I just went through the records, and they had who died, when they died, so you can get information from that. And in the cemetery where he's buried, a lot of the graves had just caved in. They were so old.
Yes.
So when we got the marker, I don't know if I got it exactly where he should. He's number 19 of Civil War soldiers buried in that cemetery.
But it's like a mass grave. That's what they just did, a mass grave of all the soldiers that were African Americans there. And that's where my stumbling block came.
Okay.
You know, trying to figure out how.
Yeah,
But
that.
I'm going to try again.
Keep trying. Don't get up. 30 years I've been doing this.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for the encouragement.
Oh, you're
I appreciate
welcome.
your
Thank
story.
you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Is anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Diane.
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
And if anybody wants a DVD, she has them for sale over here for $10. Bargain.